He dresses in the dark, each garment a familiar texture under his fingertips, linen under tunic, wool outer robe, leather belt with the small pouch for his notes and the loop for his chalk, and finally the square hood that rests against his neck. His movements are slow and practiced, with no wasted motion, as if he is part of the building's own rhythm. The cold does not trouble him. It is simply a condition of the early spring, as constant as the scriptorium's silence or the chapel's faint smell of beeswax. Once he has fastened his sandals, he takes the tallow candle from the shelf beside his bed, a stubby thing, already half burned from the previous evening, and the flint and steel from their leather pouch. A single strike, a second, a third, and the wick catches with a tiny hiss. The flame steadies to a small orange point that barely pushes back the dark. He cups his hand around the flame and crosses the dormitory toward the narrow turnpike stair that leads down to the cloister walk. The stair is worn in the middle of each tread from centuries of feet, and he places his own feet exactly where the stone dips, as if following an invisible path. The walls on either side are rough, holding the cold with a dampness that makes the candle flutter. He reaches the ground level and steps into the cloister, where the open arcade looks onto the garth, a square of neglected grass, still brown from frost. The sky above the garth is a pale slate blue, not yet bright, and a few wispy clouds hang without moving. He walks along the north walkway, his candle the only light until he reaches the low archway that gives onto the cellar yard. Outside, the air is sharper, carrying the smell of wet soil and the faint mineral tang of the well. He passes the wellhead, its stone lip dark with moisture, and arrives at the heavy door of the cellar. The door is oak, strapped with iron, its lower edge greenish where moss has grown in the permanently damp lintel. A large iron key hangs from a hook under a small stone canopy, and he lifts it down, its weight cold and solid in his hand. The lock turns with a deep thunk, and he pushes the door inward. It swings without complaint, its hinges greased with tallow by his own hand last autumn. The darkness inside pools thickly, and the candle's flame stretches and bends as he enters, finally settling once he pulls the door to behind him. The cellar floor is packed earth, beaten hard over decades, and it holds the cold of the whole winter beneath its smooth surface. You feel it through his sandals as he descends the 7 worn stone steps, each one broader and less even than the last, until he stands at the bottom. Here the air changes completely. The cold is not the sharp, moving cold of outside, but a steady, still chill that sits in the lungs like a sip of cold water. It carries a dense mixture of scents layered one over another, damp oak from the barrels, old stone from the vaulted ceiling, fermenting apples from the cider casks, a hint of yeast and hops from the ale, and behind everything the faint, clean smell of wet earth. The candle barely illuminates the far walls, revealing only the nearest rows of barrels resting on wooden stillions. He stands for a moment just breathing, letting his eyes adjust to the weak light. The silence down here is different from any other part of the monastery, thicker, broken only by the occasional slow drip of condensation falling from the arch of the low ceiling onto the floor somewhere in the darkness. This sound is so regular and quiet that it quickly becomes part of the silence itself, a steady beat marking the passage of minutes without hurry. He knows every corner of this cellar, every crack in the stone, every barrel by its position and shape, but he still approaches each task as if it were new and required his full attention. That is the role of the cellarer, not to rush through a list, but to give every cask its due moment of care. He moves toward the eastern wall, where a series of chalk marks on the stone arch show the order of his rounds. The first mark is a simple cross inside a circle, drawn by his own hand the week before. Beside it hangs a wooden board with numbered pegs, each peg representing a barrel that needs tasting and recording. Today there are many pegs on the board, for the spring tasting is the most complete of the year. He lifts the board down and tucks it under his arm, then turns back to the work table near the bottom of the steps. The table is a plain plank of elm, set on 2 trestles, stained with years of wine drips and ale splashes. On it rest his tools, a small pewter-tasting cup, the size of a child's palm, a glass vial for the more delicate wines, a long willow wand notched at regular intervals, a stack of clean linen cloths, a dish of soft pine wedges, a wooden mallet, a spare spile or two, and the ledger. The ledger is a thick book bound in dark leather, with pages of vellum, smooth and slightly yellowed. He opens it to the page he last wrote on, where his own handwriting runs in neat lines. Cask 17, cider, October pressing. Tasted 4th day of April. Clear, sharpness receding. Good. He reads this entry again, not because he has forgotten it, but because it pleases him to see the record as a continuous thread leading from the autumn labor of picking and pressing to this quiet moment months later. He takes a goose quill from the clay pot, tests its point on the back of his thumb, and places it across the open page. Then he lights a second candle, a fresh tallow stick, set in a simple iron holder, and sets it on the table so the 2 small flames now push back the dark. The extra light catches the edges of nearby barrels, revealing the grain of the oak and the chalk and numbers written on each head. With everything arranged, he picks up the pewter cup and the willow wand and walks back to the eastern wall. The first cask stands on the lowest stillion, a cider barrel of medium size, its wood stained nearly black where liquid has seeped and dried over the winter months. The bung is in place, a tapered plug of soft pine tapped flush with the surface. A thin ring of dried apple residue marks the seam. He places the candle on a small stone ledge nearby and crouches, bringing his eyes level with the cask. His knees make no sound against the earth floor. He runs a hand over the barrel's staves, feeling for any dampness or softness that might signal a leak, but the wood is firm and dry to the touch. Satisfied, he takes the wooden mallet and taps the bung lightly around its edge, loosening it, until he can pull it free with a gentle twist. A soft breath of air escapes, carrying a scent that is both sharp and sweet, the aroma of apples transformed by slow fermentation into something deeper. He holds the pewter cup under the opening and removes the small spile that plugs the access hole, allowing a thin stream of cider to flow into the cup. The liquid is pale gold with a faint amber hue, and even in the candlelight he can see it is clear, with no cloudiness or floating particles. He lets the cup fill to about 1/3 of its depth, then replaces the spile and taps the bung back into place with the heel of his hand. Rising with the cup, he carries it to the table where the light is better. Before tasting, he holds the cup up to the candle and looks through the liquid at the flame. The light passes through cleanly, showing only a gentle golden glow. He lowers the cup and breathes in the aroma. It smells of ripe apples and a hint of something floral, like the blossom that covered the orchard trees almost a year ago. There is no vinegar smell, no mustiness. He nods to himself, a small motion of the chin that no one sees. The first taste is small, just a sip that he lets rest on the front of his tongue. The sharpness that was so pronounced in November has softened into a mellow tang, replaced now by a rounder, fuller taste. He takes a second sip, this time letting the cider reach the back of his mouth, where a slight natural sweetness appears. He swallows slowly, feeling the warmth of the liquid descend. There is nothing harsh or unbalanced, no hint of spoilage. He sets the cup down, picks up the quill, dips it in the iron gall pot, and writes in a steady hand, 5th day of April, Cask 1, East Wall, cider from autumn press, clear pale gold, bouquet of apple blossom and ripe fruit, palate sharpness fading to mellow, slight sweetness, no fault, sound. He blots the ink with a scrap of linen and reads the line once more. Then he draws a small cross beside the entry to indicate the cask has been sampled. He empties the remaining cider from the pewter cup into a clay jar kept for that purpose. The jar to be taken later to the kitchen for use in cooking or for the lay brother's table. He wipes the cup with a clean linen cloth, folds the cloth, and sets it aside. The willow wand is still clean. He picks it up and returns to the cask, inserting it through the spile hole until the notched end touches the bottom. He withdraws it and reads the wet line. The level sits at the 10th notch from the top, meaning the barrel is a little more than half full. He makes a small note beside the tasting entry, level 10 notches from top, sufficient for the season. The wand is wiped dry on another cloth and the cask is left as it was, solid on its stillion. The whole process has taken perhaps 10 minutes, but time in the cellar feels elastic. You notice that the drips of condensation continue at the same pace. The candles burn down imperceptibly, and the cold remains a steady presence that wraps around everything. The cellarer moves on to the next chalk mark, a simple vertical line drawn on the stone. This cask is a twin of the first, from the same pressing batch, made from the same orchard's apples. He repeats the inspection, feel the staves for dampness, check the iron hoops for rust, loosen the bung, draw a small stream of cider into the cup, replace the bung, carry to table. The liquid looks nearly identical in color, perhaps a shade paler. He holds it up, breathes, sips, notes the same mellowing qualities, and writes a similar entry, varying only the cask number and a slight observation that this one has a touch more acidity, which he judges will keep well. He checks the level with the wand, finds it 2 notches lower than the first cask, and records it. The third cask in the row is smaller, an experimental barrel filled from a single tree, a very old apple tree near the orchard wall, known for producing small, intensely flavored fruit. The cellarer treats this one with extra attention. The cider from it is darker, almost honey-colored, and when he tastes it, he holds the sip for a longer moment before swallowing. The flavor is more complex, with a nutter undertone and a dryness that cleans the mouth. He writes, Cask 3, small reserve from the wall tree, deep golden, bouquet of dried apple and hazelnut, dry and clean, very sound. He adds a small star beside the entry, his own private mark of quality, a habit no one else comments on because no one else reads the ledger so closely. He works his way along the eastern wall through 5 more cider casks, each one receiving the same steady ritual: stave check, bung loosened, sample drawn, color and clarity observed, aroma inhaled, 2 sips taken, entry written, level measured, cup wiped. The similarities among them are many, but the small variations keep his attention engaged. One cask has a faint smell of damp straw that he notes without alarm, for it often comes from the barrels stored nearest the outside wall, where the earth's moisture rises. He writes the detail and moves on. Another cask produces cider with a slight effervescence, a few tiny bubbles rising in the cup, and he records this with pleasure, knowing the brothers enjoy a little liveliness in their drink. The chalk marks on the wall are slowly passed, the board of pegs growing lighter as he removes each wooden peg after recording its corresponding barrel. By the time he reaches the end of the eastern row, the 2 candles have burned down noticeably, the taller one now matching the stubby one from his cell. The cellar's darkness seems to have drawn a little closer, or perhaps his eyes have simply grown accustomed to the small circle of light. He stretches his back slowly, placing both hands on his lower spine and leaning backward a fraction. The cold air has stiffened his fingers, so he blows on them softly before picking up a fresh linen cloth. The next section of the cellar lies along the south wall under the low arched ceiling, where the small ale casks for daily table await, but he does not hurry toward them. He stands for a moment in the middle of the floor, listening to the drip of condensation and the distant muffled sound of the cloister bell that may be ringing prime in the world above. Down here, the sound is barely more than a vibration in the stone. He makes a mental note of the time and returns his attention to the cellar, where the quiet tasks stretch ahead like the row of chalk marks on the wall, each one waiting in turn, none demanding more than gentle patience and a careful hand. He has not moved from the cellar floor for what might be an hour, though the bells above tell no clear time down here. You watch him set the wooden pegboard back on its hook and flex his fingers once, twice, the knuckles cracking softly in the silence. The 2 candles continue their slow decline, and the drips of condensation from the vault fall at intervals you could count but never remember. Without speaking, without any outward sign of hurry or weariness, he turns toward the south wall, where the 9 cider barrels from last autumn's pressing rest on their wooden stillions. The south wall runs the length of the cellar from the base of the steps to the shadowed corner where the ceiling dips lowest. Here the stone is even colder, for the earth on the other side is piled higher against the monastery's outer foundation, shading the wall from every hour of sun. A faint bloom of nitra whitens the mortar joints, and the stillions, 3 long beams of oak set on short legs, carry the barrels in a neat row with just enough space between each for a man to crouch. The barrels themselves are larger than those on the east wall, each one holding the juice of many bushels pressed in the orchard behind the granary, fermented under the cellarer's watchful eye through the dark months. Their hoops are iron, their staves chestnut and pale oak, and each head is marked with a chalk number running from 10 to 18 in the same steady hand that writes in the ledger. He walks to the south wall slowly, carrying the pewter cup in one hand and a clean folded linen cloth in the other. The packed earth gives a little under his sandals, a sensation so familiar it barely registers. He sets the candle in its iron holder on the nearest stillion, positioning it so the flame illuminates the barrel heads and the ground immediately before them. A second candle he places on a small outcrop of stone where a block was left unfinished when the cellar was built. The light pulls gently, picking up the grain of the wood and the faint sparkle of moisture beading on the iron rims. He draws a fresh breath of the cellar air, now warmer by a degree or two in this corner from the slow respiration of the fermenting casks, and begins. The first cask of the row, marked with the chalk numeral 10, sits a little below chest height. He crouches before it, letting his weight settle evenly on the balls of his feet, and runs his palm across the flat head where the bung is set. The wood is dry, the bung tight, and the only scent that rises from the seam is the clean smell of apple and old oak. With the wooden mallet, he taps the bung's edges in a small circle, loosening it just enough, then pulls it free with a gentle twist. A tiny whisper of gas escapes, and he catches the first breath of the cider, bright and fruity. The spile hole beneath is stopped with a slender wooden peg that he eases out with thumb and forefinger. Into this opening he slides the spile, a tapered wooden tap wound with a strip of linen to fill the gap, and then he tips the cask forward a finger's width on its stillion so the liquid flows toward the opening. The thin stream that falls into the pewter cup is a clear golden brown, the color of fallen apple leaves after rain. He catches half a cup, rights the cask, withdraws the spile, replaces the bung with a firm push, and rises. At the table he holds the cup to the candle and watches the light move through the liquid without a trace of cloud. The aroma reaches him next, a gentle mingling of ripe apple flesh, a hint of blossom honey, and a background note of damp straw that he recognizes as the signature of this particular batch. He sips, letting the cider spread across his tongue from front to back. The sharpness that dominated in November has softened into a pleasant tartness, while the sweetness, once hidden, has begun to bloom under the acidity like a crocus under cold soil. He swallows slowly, feeling no harshness or astringency, and then takes a second sip simply to confirm the first impression. It matches. He writes in the ledger, Cask 10, south wall, autumn pressing, golden brown and bright, bouquet of apple and clover honey, palate lively with balanced tartness and emerging sweetness. No fault sound. He empties the cup's remainder into the clay jar, wipes the cup, and walks back to the row. The next cask, number 11, is a twin in size and wood, but its bung sits at a slightly different angle, pushed in a fraction deeper when it was closed months ago. He loosens it with a firmer tap of the mallet, a single solid knock that echoes once against the low ceiling before the silence returns. The cider that flows from this barrel is a shade paler, more amber than brown, and as it arcs into the cup, it catches the candlelight with a glassy shimmer. This one he brings to his nose before even rising, crouching with the cup near the stillion, and the aroma that rises has a sharper edge, a trace of green apple skin, and something like a cool, breezy orchard morning. He takes the first sip there on the spot, cupping the pewter with both hands. The tartness is still quite forward, a crisp bite that lingers on the sides of the tongue, but underneath it, the mellow sweetness is beginning its slow work, and the overall effect is clean and refreshing. He stands, walks to the ledger and writes, Cask 11, paler amber, bright, nose of green apple and cold morning air, palate shows retained sharpness, with sweetening undernote, clean finish. The third cask, number 12, is a smaller barrel, a close-grained oak vessel that once held wine from the Loire before being sent north and reused for the monastery's cider. He has always treated this one with a little extra care because the wood still carries a ghost of its former contents. When he pulls the bung, the vapor that escapes is noticeably different, a deeper, more rounded fragrance that blends apple with a soft vanillin breath. The cider pours into the cup with a slightly thicker flow, a rich gold with a hint of copper at the rim. He tastes, and the winey undertone greets him at once, a gentle whiff of something almost nutty, like blanched almonds, before the apple asserts itself. There is no fault, only complexity. He writes a longer entry, Cask 12, small Loire oak, deep gold with copper edge, aroma of baked apple, vanilla, and almond, palate soft with integrated acidity. The old wine note complements the fruit, very sound. After wiping the cup, he pauses to stretch his back, bending it the other way and rolling his shoulders once. A drip of condensation lands on the toe of his sandal without him noticing. The row of casks stretches on, 6 more barrels waiting in the dimness, and he turns back with the cup still cool in his hand. The 4th cask, number 13, presents a small surprise when he taps the bung. The wood around the hole feels slightly damp, not wet enough to signal a leak, but enough to suggest the bung had shifted a hair's width during a warmer day. He wipes the area with a clean cloth, sniffs the cloth, and finds only normal cider scent. The sample he draws is darker than the 3 before, a ruddy amber with a faint haze suspended in the liquid. He carries it to the candle and studies the haze. It does not swirl or settle, and the aroma is wholesome, with the deep fruitiness of well-ripened apples. He tastes with extra care, rolling the sip across every part of his tongue, searching for any off note. There is none. The flavor is round and full, the tartness completely receded into a gentle background warmth, and a subtle sweetness like dried apple rings emerges on the finish. He writes, Cask 13, slight haze but stable, color ruddy amber, nose of dried apple and a touch of leather, palate mellow with fully softened acidity, sweet dried fruit finish, sound but watch for clarity. The 5th cask, number 14, is back to a clear, bright pause, and he moves through the tasting quickly, the ritual now flowing with a smooth rhythm. Its cider is almost identical to that of cask 10, the same golden brown clarity and the same balanced tart-sweet profile, and he records it with a brief note, cask 14, matching cask 10 in color, clarity, and taste, sound. The brevity of the entry is its own form of care, for an overly long note might suggest doubt where none exists. He replaces the bung, checks the level with the willow wand, and marks the wet line at the 9th notch from the top. This one is still quite full, which pleases him. He wipes the wand dry and resets it on the table. At the 6th cask, number 15, he encounters the first faint hint of something he must evaluate with great attention. The aroma as he crouches beside the barrel has a subtle sharpness, not the crisp tartness of green apple, but an edge closer to vinegar, just the merest suggestion, like a distant thought. He draws the sample with his hands steady and carries it to the candle, tilting it left and right to check for any film or frettiness. The liquid is clear, and the smell when he brings the cup close is mostly clean apple with that tiny acetic flicker at the far edge of the breath. He tastes. The sip enters cool and normal, but at the very back of the swallow there is a faint catch, a slight prickling that might be the earliest stage of acetification. It is not yet flawed. The brothers would find it perfectly drinkable, perhaps even pleasantly sharp, but he notes it carefully. Cask 15, clear golden brown, aroma shows a trace of volatile acidity at the edges, palate still sound with a tiny prickling finish. Monitor closely. He adds a small mark in the margin, a circle with a dot, which will remind him to return to this cask before the month is out. The 7th cask, number 16, restores the calm order. Its cider is the palest yet, a color almost like dry straw, and the taste is mild to the point of gentleness, with very little acid and a soft, pillowy mouthfeel. It would be the right drink for a brother recovering from a fever, or for the very old monks in the infirmary. He writes, Cask 16, pale straw, clear, nose very mild with a faint floral note, palate low acid, soft and simple, good for the infirmary table. He sees no need for further comment and moves on. The last 2 casks, number 17 and 18, sit almost in the corner under the lowest part of the vault, where the cellar wall meets the floor in a damp seam of darker stone. He has to carry the candle down to them, bending his head under the sloping ceiling. The first of these, cask 17, is a late pressing from the small bitter apples that grow on espaliered trees against the kitchen garden wall. The cider from these apples always carries a pleasant astringency, a drying of the cheeks and gums that clears the mouth entirely. He pours a sample and sees it is deep brown, the color of strong tea, and when he tastes it the tannins are still firm, pulling gently at his lips, but the fruit underneath is rich and dark. He writes, Cask 17, late bitter apple pressing, deep brown, clear tannic grip still present, dark fruit flavor sound will continue to soften. The last cask, number 18, is another experimental one, a blend of apple and a small quantity of wild pear, made on a whim when the pears fell early and could not be stored. The result is a cider with a faint floral perfume and a lightness on the tongue that seems almost to evaporate. He tastes twice, enjoying the delicate quality, and writes, Cask 18, apple and wild pear blend, pale amber, bright floral nose with a hint of pear skin, light body, clean finish, a success. He sets the cup down on the table for the last time in this round, wipes it carefully, and checks the pegboard. All 9 pegs for the south wall row have been removed. The ledger page has grown dense with entries, each line a few words capturing weeks of quiet fermentation. He reads them over, not for errors, but for the satisfaction of a complete record. Then he blows gently on the ink to dry it, closes the ledger, and stands in the middle of the cellar floor, listening to the drips and the absolute stillness that follows the conclusion of a task. The cold spring air has not warmed at all, and his breath still clouds a little near the candle flame. Off in the northeast corner, the small ale casks for daily table wait under the low arch, but he does not go to them yet. He stays where he is, a man and a ledger, and 9 barrels resting in the dark, and the moment stretches out without a sound. He sets the cloth down on the table's edge, folds it once, and lets the quiet settle again before turning toward the low arch set into the north wall. The arch is older than the rest of the cellar, its stones smaller and more irregular, taken from an earlier building long before the monastery was rebuilt. Beneath it, the ceiling dips so low that even a man of his moderate height must stoop to pass. Beyond the arch lies a small separate chamber, more a recess than a room, where the shorter barrels of small ale rest in 2 neat rows on a floor of packed earth so cold and dry that moss has never grown there. You watch him take the candle from the stone outcrop and carry it across the main cellar, his hand cupping the flame as he passes through the arch with his head bowed. The light glances off the rough stone of the low ceiling, revealing the chisel marks of masons who worked 300 years earlier, their names lost, their breath once clouding in a winter much like this one. He straightens on the other side and places the candle on a natural ledge where a stone juts from the wall at just the right height. A second candle from his leather pouch is lit from the first and set on the floor a safe distance from the nearest barrel, its flame doubling the shadows and revealing the whole small chamber at once. The ale casks are indeed shorter than the cider barrels, built to hold a volume that will empty within a fortnight, so that the ale stays fresh for the brothers' daily table. They rest not on stillions, but on low wooden cradles, shaped like shallow troughs, each one worn smooth in the middle, from years of rubbing against the barrel's belly. The cradles keep the casks off the cold earth by only 3 finger widths, just enough for the air to circulate and discourage rot. He counts 7 casks in the front row and 5 behind, 12 in total, each marked with a chalk number from 19 to 30. The numbers are written not on the head but on the flank, for the heads of these casks are too small and face the wall. The ale inside them was brewed in the monastery brewhouse by his assistant, a lay brother called Aldrich, who has a gentle hand with the mash tun and the hops. The Cellarer trusts Aldrich's work, but trust does not remove the duty of tasting. Every barrel must pass his own lips before it passes anyone else's. He begins with the cask nearest the arch, number 19. To inspect it, he must crouch low, bending his knees wide and placing one hand on the cradle for balance. The barrel is chestnut with 3 iron hoops, and the bung sits on the upward curve of the flank. He runs a thumb around the bung's edge, feeling for any stickiness that might signal a slow seep of fermenting ale, but the wood is dry and cool. He works the bung free with his fingers alone, because the ale casks are opened frequently and the bungs are fitted loose enough for a quick hand. The smell that rises from the open hole is mild and grainy, with the faintest sweetness of malt, and the soft, floral hop note that hangs in the cold air like the memory of a summer hedgerow. He draws a half cup by tipping the barrel slightly in its cradle, the liquid flowing dark amber into the pewter. Replacing the bung takes only a gentle push until it sits flush. At the candle on the wall ledge, he holds the cup to the flame and looks through the ale. It is clear, a deep amber with a reddish glint at the edges, and there is no haze, no drifting particles, no surface film. He breathes in the aroma, fresh baked bread crust, a hint of meadow grass, and the clean, bitter tang of dried hop cones. The first sip is cool and mild, with a soft carbonation that barely prickles. The malt flavor is light, more like well-cooked oats than roasted grain, and the hops present themselves not as a sharp bitterness, but as a gentle drying note that cleans the tongue and invites another swallow. He takes a second sip, letting it sit longer at the back of his mouth, and finds the finish smooth with no astringency. This is good small ale, fit for every day, and he writes in the ledger, Cask 19, small ale, brewed 20th of March, clear dark amber, nose of bread and meadow, palate mild with light hop dryness, very sound. He empties the cup's remainder into the clay jar, wipes it, and shifts his way to the next cask. Number 20 is a twin in size but slightly older, brewed a week earlier from the same mash bill. When he pulls the bung, the scent that greets him is similar, but with a faint tang of something nutty, like chestnut flower. The sample he draws is a shade paler, a honey amber, and the clarity is perfect. He sips and finds the ale has developed a little more depth, the malt rounding out and the hop bitterness settling into the background. It will be gone soon, for this cask is already half empty, and he notes Cask 20, brewed 13th of March, honey amber, clear, nutty malt note emerging, mild and clean, used within the week. The third cask, number 21, gives him a small pause because the bung feels tighter than the others, swollen a little by the moisture of the ale. He wiggles it free with careful pressure, and when it comes loose a soft hiss of gas escapes, carrying a slightly sharper aroma, a hint of green apple mingled with the malt. The ale in the cup is cloudier than the previous samples, a faint dullness that does not move or settle. He holds it up to the candle for a long count. The cloudiness is even, a soft haze like morning mist, and it does not progress to anything thicker. He tastes with extra care. The flavor is normal, pleasant even, a touch more acidity than the others, but no sourness, no off-taste. He writes, Cask 21, slight uniform haze, aroma shows green apple and malt, palate lively with mild acidity, sound but monitor for stability. The fourth cask, number 22, is a newer barrel of raw oak that still smells of the cooper's yard, the wood resinous and pale. The ale inside has taken on a faint vanilla character from the fresh staves, and when he pours the half cup, the color is a beautiful pale gold, almost like a thin honey. The taste is the lightest yet, with a fleeting sweetness that vanishes into a dry, clean finish. He writes, Cask 22, new oak, pale gold, brilliant clarity, vanilla and light malt, very delicate, best within a fortnight. He moves to the back row now, stepping carefully over the low cradles so as not to disturb any barrel. The second row is set against the far wall, where the stone is rougher and the temperature a degree colder, and he notes how the chill affects the ale in the cup, the liquid feeling cooler on his tongue, even without any loss of flavor. The first cask in this row, number 23, is an ale brewed with a small addition of oats, a recipe the abbot himself requested for its softness on the stomach. The pour is smooth and creamy, the color a cloudy pale brown, like fine river silt suspended in water. He sips and finds the texture indeed rich, almost silky, with a gentle sweetness that has no edges. The hops are barely perceptible, just a faint brush of bitterness at the very end. He writes, Cask 23, oat ale, pale brown with soft cloud, creamy mouthfeel, mild sweet malt, light hop finish, good for the abbot's table. Number 24 is a standard small ale, and he passes through the tasting with an economy of motion born from long practice. Stoop, draw, check, sip, write. The entry is short, Cask 24, clear brown, clean malt, mild bitterness, sound. He sets the cup down and flexes his fingers, the cold now settled in his knuckles, and then picks it up again. Number 25 is a cask he remembers from the brewing day, because Aldrich had tried a new variety of hops brought by a travelling merchant the previous autumn. These hops are smaller and darker than the usual ones, and they give the ale a different kind of bitterness, a deep herbal note almost like sage. The here are deep brown and very clear, and when he tastes it, the bitterness is the first thing he notices, spreading slowly across the back of his tongue and lingering there for several heartbeats. It is not harsh, but it is present, and he imagines it would cut through the richness of the bean pottage served on fast days. He writes, Cask 25, new small dark hops, deep herbal bitterness, ruddy brown, clear robust character, keep for supper on fast days. Number 26 is another experimental cask, a blend of the last of a previous batch with the first of the new, which Aldrich sometimes does to avoid wasting any sound ale. The result is a mix that is neither old nor young, with a taste that shifts as he holds it in his mouth, a moment of treacly sweetness, then a bright hoppy flash, and finally a quiet clean finish. The colour is a medium amber with a slight chill haze from the cold. He writes, Cask 26, blend of old and new batches, medium amber, flavours of treacle and hop, clean finish, use soon. The seventh cask of the back row, number 27, sits slightly askew in its cradle, and he pauses to level it, lifting the near end a finger's width and settling it back into the worn groove. Then he draws the sample. The ale is a plain, honest brown, clear and unremarkable in the best way, and it tastes exactly as small ale should, refreshing, mild, quenching. He writes, Cask 27, plain brown ale, clear, mild all through, fully sound for daily table. The front row still holds 3 more casks, numbers 28 through 30, and he returns to them with the candle now burning low, the tallow pooling in the holder and sending up a thin thread of smoke that bends in a draught he cannot feel. Number 28 is the largest of the small ale casks, a barrel that holds nearly double the others, used when the monastery expects many guests. It is still almost full, the level at the very top notch, because the spring has been quiet and few travellers have come. The ale inside is bland sweet and a little flat from sitting so long undisturbed, but still perfectly sound. And he writes a note, Cask 28, large ale, mild, slight flatness from rest. Stir before serving. Number 29 gives him a small pleasure, because when he pulls the bung, a tiny spurt of foam rises from the spile hole, showing the ale is still lively inside. The sample in the cup carries a thin white collar that settles into a ring around the edge. The taste is fresh and effervescent, with a bright malty sparkle and a quick clean finish. He smiles without meaning to, a slight lift at the corner of his mouth that no one sees, and writes, Cask 29, lively, good foam, bright malt, fresh finish, excellent condition. The final cask, number 30, is the very oldest small ale left in the cellar, brewed in late February, and he approaches it with the careful attention he gives everything that has aged past its expected span. The bung comes free with a slight stick, and the aroma that rises is deeper and maltier than the others, with a tone like dark bread crust and a faint whiff of dried fruit. The ale in the cup is darker, a rich walnut brown, and perfectly clear. He tastes. The age has done it no harm. It has simply mellowed further, the edges rounded away, the hop bitterness faded into a gentle buzz. There is no sourness, no must, just a quiet depth like the silence at the bottom of a well. He writes, Cask 30, oldest small ale, brewed late February, dark walnut, clear, deep malty aroma with dried fruit, mellow and smooth, still very sound. He sets the quill down and stretches his back, hearing the faint pop of a vertebra somewhere in the middle of his spine. The pegboard now has 12 pegs removed, and the small ale chamber has been fully recorded. He gathers his tools, the pewter cup wiped clean, the cloth folded, the spare candle snuffed with a pinch of thumb and forefinger so it will last another day. The main candle he carries with him back through the low arch into the larger cellar, where the air seems vast after the close alcove. The drips of condensation continue in their slow pattern, and the darkness has not moved or changed shape. He walks to the table, opens the ledger to a fresh part of the page, and writes a single summary line at the bottom of the ale entries. All small ale casks sound and ready for the refectory, none needed to be drawn early. The cold spring morning has continued above ground while he worked, though he has no direct knowledge of it, except the faint change in the dim grey glow from the high window slits. The light now is slightly brighter, a pale wash that touches the upper curve of the barrel hoops and reveals the fine dust that floats in the still air. He closes the ledger again, rests his hands flat on the cover and waits for a moment, not thinking of anything in particular, just letting the quiet seep into him, the way the cold has seeped into the stones. Then he picks up the candle, checks that the clay jar is still steady on the table, and turns his attention toward the north corner where the 4 squat casks of honey mead wait in the deepest cold, their wax seals unbroken and their flavors slowly turning toward a drier, older complexity. That task will come next, in its own time, and he feels no need to hurry toward it. The cellar will not go anywhere, and the casks will not empty themselves in his brief absence. For now, there is only the slow, steady rhythm of the day, one barrel following another, each one a small, quiet world contained in oak. The north corner of the cellar feels different from the moment you turn toward it. The ceiling lowers in a shallow slope where the vault meets the outer foundation wall, and the stones here are larger, darker, and perpetually damp from their contact with the piled earth outside. A thin sheen of moisture covers the wall in patches, catching the candlelight in glistening beads that never run, never fall, only hang there with a patient stillness. The cellarer walks slowly across the packed floor, the candle held low so he can see where the ground becomes ever so slightly softer near the corner, a place where the earth floor has never fully dried in all the years of his service. The temperature drops a full degree with each step, and when he reaches the 4 squat casks of honey mead resting directly on the floor against the sweating stone, his breath forms a cloud that lingers rather than dispersing. He sets the candle on a small 3-legged stool kept in the corner for this purpose and lets the light wash over the barrels. These casks are different from all the others in the cellar. They are short and wide, shaped more like drums than barrels, and their wood is paler, a honey-colored birch that seems almost to glow in the dimness. Each one is bound with 3 hoops of brass rather than iron, for brass does not rust in the damp and will not taint the delicate drink inside. The heads are sealed with a thick layer of wax around the bung, a soft golden wax that carries the imprint of the abbot's seal, applied last autumn when the mead was first run into the casks from the fermenting vat. The wax has never been broken, and the cellarer is the only person permitted to touch these seals. He regards them now with a quiet, habitual reverence, not because the mead is sacred, but because it is rare. The monastery's apiary produces only enough honey each year to fill 4 small casks, and the mead is reserved for the highest feasts and for the visit of the bishop, which may or may not come this summer. He removes his sandals before stepping closer, leaving them side by side at the edge of the corner, a habit he keeps to avoid tracking any stray grit onto the casks. The packed earth is cold and smooth under his bare feet, almost slick with the permanent moisture. He takes a clean linen cloth from the stack on his work table and brings it to the first cask, then kneels on the floor with both knees on a folded bit of sacking left there for this purpose. The cask before him, marked with a small brass tally tag reading number 31, sits with its bung facing upward on the top head, and the wax seal is thick and unbroken, the abbot's ring mark clear in the dimpled surface. Before he can taste the mead, he must clean the bung area completely, for any dust or old wax crumbs that fall into the opening could spoil the contents. He wipes the flat top of the cask in slow, overlapping circles, starting from the outer edge of the wax and spiraling inward until the whole surface gleams. The cloth comes away with only a faint trace of dust, and he folds it to a clean side before proceeding. Next, he removes the wax seal with a small bone knife kept in his leather pouch, a thin blade no longer than his thumb. He works the tip under the edge of the wax, where it meets the wood, and gently pries upward, moving around the bung in a careful circle until the entire seal lifts off in one piece like a small golden lid. The wax crackles softly as it separates, a tiny dry sound that echoes against the damp stone before vanishing. He sets the seal aside on the stool beside the candle, its underside revealing the dark wood of the bung beneath. The bung itself is a plug of birch wood, lighter than the oak bungs in the cider barrels, and it fits so snugly that he must hook his fingernail into the faint groove along its edge to draw it upward. It comes free with a soft pop, like a child pulling a thumb from its mouth, and the scent that rises from the opening is the first true honey smell of the morning. He leans over the cask and inhales, not deeply but steadily, letting the aroma fill his awareness. It is sweet and warm despite the cold air, with the floral heaviness of clover honey and a faint edge of something spiced that he associates with the wild thyme that grows on the hill above the apiary. There is no harsh alcohol note, no must, no sign of any trouble. The mead is still young, barely 6 months in the cask, and the fermentation has been slow because of the cold spring. He can tell from the scent alone that it remains in its sugary youth, the honey flavor dominant and the yeast still working its quiet transformation in the depths of the liquid. He sits back on his heels and takes the pewter-tasting cup, which he first rinses with a splash of clean water from a small leather bottle at his belt, and dries with a fresh corner of the cloth. Into the cask he lowers a glass pipette, a slender tube that draws up a small amount of liquid without disturbing the sediment. The mead rises into the pipette, pale gold and thick like a thin syrup, and he transfers a single drop into the cup. He needs no more than a drop. The taste of mead is so concentrated that even this small amount will tell him everything. He holds the cup close to the candle and tilts it so the mead spreads across the bottom. The color in this light is the pale gold of summer honey, with a faint greenish flash at the rim that speaks of the clover and acacia blossoms the bees worked last year. The clarity is perfect, not a speck of cloud or drifting yeast, and the surface of the drop is so smooth it reflects the flame like a tiny convex mirror. He raises the cup to his lips and touches the tip of his tongue to the mead, just enough to wet it. The sweetness arrives instantly, a full, round sweetness that coats the tongue and carries with it the floral notes he smelled earlier. Clover, a hint of lime blossom, and that background thyme note. There is no burn, no alcoholic heat, only the pure taste of fermented honey at its most innocent stage. He lets the drop spread across his tongue, into the spaces between his teeth, over the roof of his mouth where sweetness registers differently, and then he swallows. The mead goes down softly, leaving a faint warmth in his throat and a lingering aftertaste of flower petals and warm wax. He writes in the ledger, Cask 31, North Corner, honey mead, young pale gold with green glint, brilliant clarity, nose of clover, lime and wild thyme, palate fully sweet with integrated floral notes, no heat, far from dry, sound. The willow wand is next. He wipes it with the cloth and inserts it gently through the bunghole, lowering it straight down until the notched end touches the bottom of the cask. The mead is deep. The wet line shows at the third notch from the top, meaning the barrel is still nearly full, the angels having taken very little over the winter. He withdraws the wand, wipes it dry, and records level 3 notches from top, minimal loss. Then he replaces the bung with a firm push, lays the wax seal back over it loosely for the moment, and turns his attention to the second cask. This one, number 32, is identical in size and wood, but its wax seal is a slightly different color, a deeper gold because the bees that produce that honey foraged heavily on the buckwheat field that the monastery lets to a neighboring village. The terrain around the apiary is diverse, and the honey from different sections of the season carries distinct characters, so each cask is kept separate, even though they were all filled within the same week. He peels the wax seal free with the bone knife, again lifting it carefully in one piece, and sets it beside the first. The bung beneath is tight and requires the same hooked fingernail pull. When it releases, the air that escapes is noticeably different, richer, maltier, with a faint smoky undertone that comes from the buckwheat nectar. He draws a drop with the pipette and cups it in his palm for a moment to warm it slightly before tasting. The color in the cup is a deep amber, almost copper at the edges, and the clarity is once again flawless. He touches the drop to his tongue and lets it sit. The sweetness is still the dominant note, but it is a darker sweetness, like molasses thinned with honey, and underneath it there is a slight earthy quality, a flavor that reminds him of fallen leaves and the damp forest floor near the hives. The mead has more body than the first, a weightier texture that coats the mouth more thoroughly, and when he swallows the warmth travels farther down his chest. He writes, Cask 32, buckwheat honey mead, deep amber copper, brilliant clarity, nose of molten smoke, palate dark sweet with earthy undertone, fuller body, very sound. The level wand shows this cask is slightly lower, the wet mark at the fourth notch from the top. He records this without concern, Different casks lose different amounts to the wood and the slow evaporation, and the buckwheat mead seems to have been a little thirstier on the barrel. He replaces the bung and the seal and shuffles on his knees to the third cask. Number 33 contains mead made from the late summer honey, a pale watery honey gathered from the heather that blooms on the moorland edge in August. The bees produce less of this honey, and the resulting cask is the smallest of the four, a half-size barrel that barely reaches his knee. The wax seal on this one is paler, almost white, and it cracks into several pieces when he levers it with the bone knife. He catches each fragment and lays them in order on the stool, a small jigsaw of wax, before pulling the bung. The scent that comes from this cask is different again, light, almost floral in a meadowy way, with a faintly medicinal note that he recognizes as the heather's signature. The drop in the cup is the color of pale straw, practically water white at the rim, and the clarity is so complete that he can see the texture of the pewter through the drop, as though it were a lens. He tastes. The sweetness here is the gentlest of all, a fleeting kiss that vanishes almost before it registers, and what remains is a curious dryness that builds slowly, a tannic quality that heather honey sometimes carries. The flavor is delicate, with a whisper of lavender and something green like fresh hay. He writes, Cask 33, heather honey mead, half cask, pale straw, brilliant clarity, nose of meadow and lavender, palate lightly sweet with a dry heather finish, delicate and interesting, sound. The level wand touches bottom at the 9th notch from the top, and he notes it with a small frown that passes quickly. This cask has evaporated more than the others, and its small volume means it will not last as long. He makes an additional note in the margin, draw before midsummer if level continues to fall. Then he reseals the fragments of wax as best he can, pressing them back into place with his thumb, and tucks a small linen tag with the date into the crack to mark that the seal was opened today. The fourth and final cask, number 34, is the only one sealed with beeswax tinted by the red of the dandelion and wild cherry blossoms that fill the orchard in May. This honey arrived the previous year so dark and fragrant that it had to be kept in its own barrel, for it would overwhelm the other meads with its perfume. The cellarer has been curious about this cask all winter, knowing that its progress would be different. He breaks the seal with care, the dark wax snapping cleanly in two, and pulls the bung. The aroma that pours from the opening is heady, almost tropical despite the cold corner, overripe cherries, almond blossom, a touch of citrus peel, and beneath it all, the deep bass note of dark honey. He draws a drop and watches it bead in the cup like a tiny gemstone, deep garnet at the center and ruby at the edge. The color is so intense that it stains the pewter a faint pinkish brown where the drop rests. He tastes it with his eyes closed for a moment. The sweetness here is different from all the others, fruit-forward and jammy, with a slight tang like sour cherry that keeps it from becoming cloying. The texture is syrupy, and he can feel the mead clinging to his teeth after he swallows. There is a warmth that spreads into his cheeks, the first hint of alcohol making itself known, though still modest. The mead is young, but already showing complexity, and he imagines it will be extraordinary by autumn. He writes, Cask 34, orchard blossom honey mead, deep garnet, brilliant clarity, nose of cherry, almond and citrus, palate intensely fruity with balanced tang, warming finish, exceptional potential. The level check shows it is perfectly intact at the 2nd notch from the top, the fullest of all four. He records the level, then replaces the bung and the broken wax seal, adding a linen tag with the date and the note to the abbot that this cask is developing beautifully and should not be drawn before Michaelmas. The 4 mead casks are now all sampled, their contents assessed, their secrets written into the ledger in neat lines that will be read one day by someone else, perhaps a cellarer not yet born, who will see his handwriting and know that on a cold spring morning in 1180 the mead was sound. He rises from his knees slowly, using the stool for support, and puts his sandals back on one foot at a time. The cold in the north corner has seeped through the sacking and into his knees, leaving them stiff and pale. He rubs them briefly with both hands, warming the skin, then picks up the candle and the stool and moves back toward the center of the main cellar. The north corner retreats into darkness behind him, the 4 squat casks now sealed again and resting in their damp, cold silence. On the stool he has left the pieces of broken wax and the small bone knife, but he will collect those later when he returns with fresh seals. For now, the ledger must dry, and the next row of barrels waits under the 7 iron-bound hoops of the strong beer casks, their dark liquid rich with roasted grain and reserved for the highest feasts. The Cellarer pauses at the table, dips the quill once more, and writes beneath the mead entries, "All mead casks sound. None needed to be drawn early. The orchard blossom mead to be held until Michaelmas." Then he closes the ledger, stretches his back a second time, and lets the quiet of the cellar wrap around him like a second robe. You do not notice the Cellarer moving because he has become part of the stillness. But eventually his hand reaches for the wooden mallet, and this small motion redefines the space around him. The 7 larger barrels of strong beer stand along the western wall, set apart from the other casks by their size and by the deep shadow that collects under the curve of their bellies. They are bound with iron hoops, thick as a man's thumb, and they rest on cradles of heavy oak sunk into the packed earth to bear the weight. The iron bands gleam dully in the candlelight, where they are not dulled by rust bloom, and the wood of the staves is a dark, almost black chestnut that has absorbed years of cellar damp and released it again through 100 slow seasons. These casks hold a beer reserved for high feasts, Christmas, Easter, the abbot's installation anniversary, and the rare visit of a bishop. They are not drawn often, and their contents have slept undisturbed since last October, when the brew was brought down from the brew house by Aldrich and 2 lay brothers who struggled under the weight of each barrel. He approaches the first cask marked with the chalk numeral 35 and sets the mallet on the barrel head while he makes a slow circuit of inspection. You watch him walk around the cask once, then again in the opposite direction, his eyes tracing the seam where stave meets stave, looking for the dark telltale wetness of a weeping joint. He runs a finger along each iron band, feeling for the crumbling roughness of active rust, the kind that flakes and leaves a red stain on the skin. The bands are cool and mostly smooth, though the lowest one, nearest the damp floor, has a fine grainy texture that he rubs with his thumb and then wipes on his robe. Not worrying, but he notes it. The cask's head is dry, the bung seated firmly with a ring of dark resin smeared around the rim. He picks up the mallet, a wooden tool with a head of bound elm and a handle worn to the shape of his grip, and taps the bung in a slow circle, once at the top, once at the bottom, once left, once right. Each tap is measured, just enough to break the seal of dried resin, and with the 4th tap he feels the bung shift inward a hair. He pulls it with his fingers, and the moment the wood clears the hole, a soft hiss of gas escapes, carrying with it the deep, roasted scent of dark malt and a warmth that seems out of place in the cold cellar. He catches the first breath of the beer with the pewter cup held close to the opening, tilting the cask a fraction to bring the liquid to the spile hole. The stream that arcs into the cup is dense and dark, the color of polished walnut, and a thin tan head of foam forms on the surface before settling into a collar that rings the cup's edge. He straightens, replaces the bung loosely, and carries the cup to the table where the light of 2 candles can reach it. Holding it up, he peers through the dark liquid at the flame. The light barely passes, only a faint ruby glow at the very rim, proving the beer is clear, but deeply opaque. He breathes in the aroma, roasted barley, a hint of molasses, the clean bitterness of old hops, and a subtle fruitiness that reminds him of dried figs. The first sip is small and deliberate. The beer fills his mouth with a richness that coats the tongue, a malty sweetness up front that segues into a firm, lingering bitterness at the back. The warmth follows the swallow, spreading down his throat and into his chest, a gentle heat that sits for a long moment. There is no sourness, no astringency beyond the intentional bite of the hops. He swallows a second sip to confirm and then writes in the ledger, Cask 35. Strong feast beer, deep walnut, opaque with ruby glint, nose of roasted malt, molasses, fig, and clean hop. Palate rich and malty with firm balancing bitterness. Warm finish, sound. He pours the remainder into the clay jar, wipes the cup, and walks to the second barrel. Number 36 is a handspan taller than the first, with iron bands that are slightly narrower and set closer together, a style from a cooper who no longer works in the village. The bung on this cask is a replacement, a pale pine plug that stands out against the dark chestnut, put in place when the original bung split during the autumn filling. He taps the mallet lightly, The pine bun, being softer, loosens with only 2 strokes, and the hiss that escapes is sharper, a quick sigh rather than a slow breath. The sample he draws is a shade paler than the first, a deep mahogany rather than walnut, and the foam that rises is creamier, lingering longer. At the table he holds the cup to the candle and sees that this beer is not quite opaque. A sliver of amber light cuts through near the bottom, the liquid clearing as it rests. The aroma has more of a burnt sugar quality, a caramel note over the dark malt, and the hops smell fresher, almost resiny. He sips. The taste is slightly sweeter than the first, with a toffee-like richness that softens the bitterness, and the finish has a smoky quality that lingers at the back of the nose after swallowing. The alcohol warmth is more pronounced here, a spreading heat that reaches the top of his ears. He writes, Cask 36, pine bun replacement. Deep mahogany with partial clarity, nose of caramel, resin and smoke, palate sweet edge with toffee and mild bitterness, warm finish, sound. The third barrel, number 37, sits a little apart from the others, its cradle having been shifted months ago to allow a mason to inspect the wall behind it. The mason never came, or came and did nothing, and the cask remains at its slight angle. He pushes it back into alignment with 1 foot, feeling the weight resist and then give way. The iron bands on this barrel show the first true rust. The lowest hoop has a patch of orange-brown bloom the size of his palm. Rough to the touch, but not yet flaking. He rubs it with the linen cloth, and the rust transfers to the fabric in a faint stain, but the metal beneath seems sound. He taps the bung, which is the original one, dark and waxed, and the hiss that emerges has a slightly acidic edge that makes him pause. He sniffs the opening directly, his nose close to the hole, and the acidity is still there but faint, a vinegar ghost that vanishes when the liquid flows into the cup. The beer is darker than the others, nearly black in the cup, and the head is thin and short-lived. He carries it to the candle and tilts it. The beer is clear when held to the light, a deep ruby black, and the aroma is complex, dark fruit, a hint of leather, and that fleeting acidic note, now tempered by a profound malty depth. He tastes with special care, holding the sip on the front of his tongue for a count of 3 before moving it back. The beer is strong and rich, with a prune-like fruitiness and a bitter chocolate finish. The acidity is present but balanced, giving the beer a liveliness that prevents heaviness. He writes Cask 37. Some surface rust on lower hoop, very dark ruby black, clear, nose of dark fruit, leather, and a fleeting volatile note. Palate rich and lively with prune and bitter chocolate. The acidity integrated and possibly intentional. Sound but note the rust for the smith. He draws a small circle around the comment about rust in the margin, the same way he marks barrels that need later attention, and proceeds to the 4th cask. Number 38 is the only one of the 7 that was brewed with a portion of oats, giving the beer a silkier texture that Aldrich had described as smooth as a prayer. The bung comes free with a satisfying pop, and the gas that escapes smells of fresh bread and dark honey. The sample pours like oil, thick and slow, and the color is a deep sienna brown with a stable, creamy head that lasts for many heartbeats. He carries the cup to the table and holds it up, watching the light struggle through the opaque liquid. The aroma is rich and bready, with a distinct honey sweetness and a very subdued hop character. He sips, and the texture is immediately different, smooth and coating, with a gentle carbonation that dances softly on the tongue. The flavor is malty and full, with a nutty undertone and a finish that is more sweet than bitter. The alcohol is well hidden, emerging only as a gentle warmth after he swallows. He writes, Cask 38, oat strong beer, sienna brown, opaque with creamy head, nose of fresh bread and honey, palate smooth and full-bodied with nutty malt and gentle sweetness, mild bitterness, very sound. The 5th cask, number 39, is the oldest of the row, brewed a full year earlier and intended for the Easter feast that is now only a few weeks away. He approaches it with the respect due to a thing that has waited patiently in the dark. The bung is tight from long sitting, and he needs both hands to work the mallet, tapping harder than before until the seal cracks with a sound like a small bone snapping. The hiss is long and deep, a slow exhalation that seems to last as long as a drawn breath. The beer that flows into the cup is a majestic deep chestnut with a garnet edge, and the foam is thin but persistent, a ring of tiny bubbles that circle the rim. Holding it to the light, he sees a rare clarity, the beer almost transparent at the edges where the garnet glows. The aroma is layered, old oak, dried cherry, a whisper of tobacco, and an earthy hop note that has mellowed into a gentle background. He sips reverently. The taste has evolved past the bold bitterness of youth into a harmonious blend of dark fruit, well-worn leather, and a soft, lingering finish that reminds him of the aftertaste of walnut skins. The warmth spreads more slowly, a gradual flush that seems to reach his fingertips. He holds the cup for a moment longer, appreciating the rarity of a beer that has aged perfectly, and writes, Cask 39, 1 year aged strong beer, deep chestnut with garnet transparency, nose of old oak, dried cherry, tobacco, and mellow hops, palate harmoniously blended with dark fruit and leather, soft finish, exemplary condition for Easter. The sixth barrel, number 40, presents the opposite experience. It is the youngest of the strong beers, a late batch brewed in November when a surplus of malt needed to be used. He expects it to be brasher, and it does not disappoint. The bung comes free with a lively pop, and a rush of foam surges from the spile hole before he can get the cup in place. He catches the overpour in the clay jar, then draws a proper sample. The beer is a cloudy mahogany with a huge billowing head that threatens to overflow the cup, and the aroma is aggressively hoppy, all pine resin and grapefruit peel over the dark malt. He sips with a slight grimace, not from displeasure but from the shock of so much bitterness so early in the tasting. The flavors are raw and punchy, the malt struggling to be heard under the hop assault, and the finish leaves a scraping dryness on the tongue. It is not flawed, it is exactly what it should be, but it needs time. He writes, Cask 40, youngest strong beer, cloudy mahogany, large head, nose extremely hoppy with pine and citrus, palate bitter forward with malt in the background, very young, needs at least 6 more months. Sound, but do not serve before winter. The seventh and final barrel, number 41, rests at the end of the row nearest the northern corner, and it has a peculiarity that he has known about since the filling day. It was brewed with a small addition of honey, a gift from the beekeeper who found a broken comb and offered it to Aldrich. The result is a beer that sits somewhere between a strong ale and a braggot. The bung is sealed with a ring of beeswax rather than resin, and he chips it away carefully with the bone knife before tapping the bung free. The scent that emerges is unmistakable. Dark malt mingled with a floral honey sweetness, almost like a mead, but earthier. The sample pours a dark amber with copper highlights, clear despite the honey, and the head is fine and white. He holds it to the light, admiring the color, then breathes in deeply. The aroma combines toasted grain, wildflower honey, and a distant spice, perhaps cinnamon, though none was added. The taste is layered and surprising. The malt and honey present themselves together, neither dominating, and the hops step back entirely, leaving only a gentle drying note. The warmth is considerable but soft, and the finish lingers with a honeyed sweetness that never becomes cloying. He writes, Cask 41, honey-strong beer, dark amber with copper, clear nose of toasted grain, wildflower honey, and a hint of spice, palate balanced between malt and honey with soft dryness. Exceptional, reserved for the abbot's table. He sets the cup down and reads through the 7 entries, his eyes moving slowly from the deep walnut of the first to the honeyed copper of the last. The ledger page holds a portrait of the cellar's strongest drinks, each one described with the plain language of his craft, no praise beyond the word sound or excellent, yet the accumulation of the lines says more than any single entry. He blots the ink with a scrap of linen, closes the ledger, and walks back along the row of casks one final time, touching each bung with the flat of his hand to ensure it is firmly seated. The iron bands are cool and dry now, and the cellar's silence has returned in full, broken only by the soft percussion of the dripping condensation that has been the background rhythm of the entire morning. He glances toward the center aisle, where 10 barrels of new wine from the monastery's southern slopes sit in a neat row. Their soft wax seals a pale red against the dark wood. The wines are still young, probably still fermenting a little in the cold, and they will require a different kind of attention, a gentler hand, a glass vial instead of the pewter cup, and a different page in the ledger. He stretches his back, rolls his shoulders once, and picks up the glass vial from the table, cleaning it with a fresh cloth. The strong beer casks are now at rest behind him, their dark contents slowly returning to stillness, and the cellar waits for the next task without demand, as it has waited for everything. The center aisle of the cellar runs in a straight line from the base of the stone steps to the far wall, where the shadows pool deepest. And it is here, along this open corridor of packed earth, that the 10 barrels of new wine from the monastery's southern vineyard are arranged. The barrels are smaller than the cider casks, and taller than the ale barrels, each one coppered from pale oak that still shows the faint marks of the adser. They sit on low wooden stillions, arranged in 2 rows of 5, with a narrow passage between them, just wide enough for a man to walk sideways. The cellarer stands at the top of the aisle, the glass vial already in his hand and a fresh candle lighting the way, and you watch him pause before entering, as if acknowledging a threshold between one task and the next. The southern vineyard lies several days' walk away on a gentle slope that catches the sun from mid-morning until dusk, and the grapes grown there are a variety the monks call simply the black grape, a thick-skinned fruit that yields a deep red wine of modest body and firm structure. The wine arrives at the monastery each autumn in large skins carried by mules, and the cellarer oversees its transfer into these 10 barrels, where it undergoes its slow transformation from raw juice into something more composed. Now, 6 months after the vintage, the wine is still young, still finding its shape, and the tasting requires a different approach from the ale or cider. The glass vial is necessary because the wine would stain the pewter cup and carry flavors into subsequent samples. The cloth is fresh and still folded. The bone knife waits in his pouch to break the wax seals. He enters the aisle sideways, his shoulder brushing the nearest barrel as he passes, and the first cask, marked with chalk as number 42, comes under the candlelight. The barrel head is smooth and pale, and across the bunghole a disc of soft red wax has been pressed and stamped with the abbot's seal, just as with the mead. The seal on this one has cracked naturally from the wood's slow movement through the winter, a hairline fissure running from the center to the edge. He tuts softly, not in disapproval, but in recognition that a cracked seal must be checked sooner than an intact one. He picks up the bone knife and levers the wax away in pieces, revealing the dark bunghole beneath. The bung is a tight cylinder of poplar, lighter than oak and unlikely to swell, and it comes free with a gentle twist. The scent that rises from the opening is the first fresh grape smell of the morning, bright and slightly sharp, with a mineral undertone that recalls the stony soil of the southern slope. He takes the glass vial and lowers its slender tip into the cask, drawing up a column of wine the color of dark garnet. The liquid clings to the glass, leaving faint purple legs as it drains back into the vial. He holds the vial up between his eye and the candle, and the light passes through the wine with difficulty, revealing a deep ruby core that shades to violet at the thinnest edge. The wine is clear, with no floating particles or surface film, but the color is dense and youthful. He uncorks the vial and pulls a small sip into his mouth, letting the wine spread across his tongue and sit there for a slow count of 5. The first impression is of tannin, a firm, drying grip that pulls at his cheeks and gums, and behind it a tart red fruit flavor that feels like biting into a sour cherry. The body is medium, not thin, but not weighty, and the finish carries a faint, earthy bitterness. He considers the taste, lets it fade, then takes a second small sip. The same profile repeats, with the fruit perhaps a little more forward, a hint of raspberry alongside the cherry. He writes in the ledger, Cask 42, new wine, sealed but seal cracked, deep garnet with violet rim, clear, nose of dark fruit and stone, palate firm red fruit with notable tannin and earthy finish. Very young, needs more cellar time. He rinses the glass vial with water from his leather bottle, shakes it dry over the packed earth, and wipes the outside with the cloth before proceeding to the next cask. Number 43 sits directly behind the first, in the second row, and his wax seal is intact, a smooth red disc without cracks. He chips it away carefully, removing it in a single piece that he sets on the barrel head. The bung beneath is slightly damp, and when he twists it free, a small bead of wine wells up from the hole and runs slowly down the stave. He catches it with the cloth before it reaches the stylium. This cask seems fuller than the first, the wine closer to the top, and when he inserts the glass vial, the liquid rises almost instantly. The colour in the vial is a purer red, less purple, with a clarity that lets him see the candle flame's reflection through the centre. He tastes. The tannin here is softer, already knitting into the body of the wine rather than standing apart, and the fruit has shifted from sour cherry to a sweeter, rounder flavour that reminds him of crushed strawberries. The earthiness is present but gentle, and the finish has a faint floral lift. He writes, Cask 43, seal intact, ruby red with good clarity, nose of strawberry and violet, palate softer with integrated tannin and floral finish, progressing well. The third cask, number 44, is a barrel that came from a different part of the vineyard, a lower terrace where the soil is deeper and the grapes ripen a week earlier. The wax seal is unbroken, and he removes it with the same steady care as the last. The scent from this bunghole is different immediately, riper and warmer, with a suggestion of plum and sun-warmed earth. The wine in the vial is visibly darker, a deep opaque crimson, and when he holds it to the light, the rim is a narrow band of bright ruby. He tastes a sip. The wine fills his mouth with a velvety richness that the first two lacked, dark plum and blackberry fruit rolled together, and the tannin is round and coating rather than sharp. The alcohol warmth, absent in the others, makes itself known as a gentle heat in his throat, and the finish carries a complex note of dried herbs. He writes, Cask 44, lower terrace fruit, deep crimson, opaque core with ruby rim, nose of plum, blackberry and warm earth, palate rich and velvety with rounded tannin, faint herbal finish, very promising. Number 45 sits at the end of the second row, in the darkest part of the centre aisle, where the candlelight barely reaches. He has to set the candle on the stillion beside the barrel and lean close to see the chalk mark. The wax seal on this one is different, a darker red, because the wax was mixed with a little of the wine itself, a custom of the cooper who made the barrel. It breaks cleanly, and he lifts it away in two halves. The bung is tighter than the rest, and he must work it free with a slight rotation back and forth until it yields. The wine that emerges in the vial is the darkest yet, a near black purple, and the clarity is harder to judge because so little light passes through. He holds the vial at an angle against the candle, and a faint gleam of violet appears at the very edge. The aroma is intense, blackcurrant, a whiff of violets, and something spicy like cracked pepper. He sips, and the wine is structured and powerful, with a tannic grip that far exceeds the others and a deep savoury character that coats the mouth. The fruit is there but held in reserve, waiting for the tannin to soften. He writes, Cask 45, wine wax seal, near black with violet edge, opaque, nose of blackcurrant, violet and pepper, palate powerfully structured with abundant tannin and savoury depth, very long aging potential. The fifth cask, number 46, returns him to the front row, and he is glad to find a barrel with a perfectly intact seal and a bung that comes free easily. The wine from this one is a surprise. It is lighter in colour than any so far, a translucent ruby with an orange tint at the rim that he notes with a slight tilt of his head. The aroma is delicate, all red berries and a faint floral perfume like dried rose petals. He sips and finds the wine has a lifted, almost airy quality on the tongue, with a bright acidity that dances and a tannin so fine it is barely perceptible. The finish is clean and short, leaving a refreshing tang behind. He writes, Cask 46, translucent ruby with orange rim, nose of red berries and rose, palate light and livid with bright acidity and fine tannin, an elegant expression. The sixth barrel, number 47, is a cask that sat on the end of the wagon during the transport from the vineyard and arrived with a small wheel on its flank from rubbing against another barrel. The mark is still visible, a pale scar in the oak, but the wood is sound and the seal, though scuffed, is unbroken. He checks the scar with a fingertip, pressing gently to ensure no softness has developed, then breaks the seal and draws a sample. The wine is a medium ruby with good clarity, and the aroma is simple and pleasant. Fresh grapes, a little greenness, and a clean stony note. He sips and finds it perfectly sound but uncomplicated. A straightforward red wine that will serve the refectory well while waiting for the finer casks to mature. He writes, Cask 47, minor stave wheel but sound, medium ruby, clear, nose of grape and stone, palate simple and clean. Good daily wine for the brothers. The seventh cask, number 48, is the first of 4 barrels that came from the uppermost terrace of the vineyard, where the slope is steepest and the soil is thinnest, mere inches of chalky rubble over the bedrock. The grapes from this terrace are always smaller, with thicker skins and a more intense concentration of flavor. The seal on this barrel is tight, and when he breaks it, the scent that rises has a distinct mineral sharpness, like wet slate after rain. The wine in the vial is a deep ruby, not opaque, and the light catches glints of true scarlet. He sips, and the concentration is immediately apparent. The fruit is dense and focused, a core of sour cherry and pomegranate wrapped in firm but fine tannin, and the acidity is noticeable, giving the wine a sense of tension and energy. The finish is long and stony. He writes, Cask 48, uppermost terrace, deep ruby with scarlet glints, nose of wet stone and dark cherry, palate concentrated with sour cherry, pomegranate and fine firm tannin, long mineral finish, exceptional potential. Number 49 is a twin from the same terrace, and he expects similarity, but the wine surprises him with a slightly different character. The aroma is more floral, with a lavender note alongside the mineral, and the fruit leans toward raspberry and red currant. The tannin is a little softer, and the acidity seems brighter, giving the wine a mouth-watering quality that makes him take a second sip simply for the pleasure of it. He writes, Cask 49, same terrace, ruby with good clarity, nose of lavender, raspberry and chalk, palate bright with red currant and softer tannin, mouth-watering and lively. The 9th barrel, number 50, is the only one of the 10 that shows any real flaw, and he spots it before he even touches the seal. A thin, sticky residue has collected around the base of the wax, dark and almost crystalline, the dried evidence of a slow seep through the bung. He breaks the seal with extra care and runs a finger around the bunghole after the wax is clear. The wood is damp but not soft, and the seep appears to have been slight and recent. He draws a sample with particular attention. The wine in the vial is slightly duller than the others, a muted ruby with a faint brownish tinge at the rim that he does not like. He tastes a very small sip, holding it on the front of his tongue and checking for any off flavor. The wine tastes a little flat, the fruit muted, and there is a vague, dusty quality on the finish, but no vinegar, no mold, no irredeemable fault. He swallows and waits, then tastes again. The dusty note persists, but does not develop into anything worse. He writes, Cask 50, slight bung seep, color muted with brownish rim, nose quiet and subdued, palate flat with dusty finish, no active spoilage but declining. Monitor closely and consider blending with sound cask. The 10th and final barrel, number 51, restores the order. Its seal is intact, it's bung tight, and the wine inside is a beautiful, clear ruby with a bright, inviting perfume of fresh berries and a hint of violet. He sips with relief, finding the wine balanced and lively, with soft tannin and clean acidity, a thoroughly sound young red that needs only time to gain complexity. He writes, Cask 51, clear ruby, nose of fresh berries and violet, palate balanced with soft tannin and clean acidity, sound and promising. He sets the glass vial on the table beside the ledger and reads through the 10 entries, each one marking a slightly different point on the slow arc from raw youth toward mature wine. The row of barrels now stands entirely inspected, their contents described and assessed, the problematic cask noted for future action. He pours the remains of the clay jar's accumulated dregs into a bucket kept in the corner, the mixed liquid swirling together in a dark pool, then rinses the jar with water. The cellar's silence, which had seemed to step back during the active tasting, returns fully as he stands motionless, letting the cold wrap around him again. The high window slits show a light that is brighter now, the grey of early spring having lifted a shade toward pale daylight, and he understands without hearing any bell that the morning has advanced. He dries his hands on the cloth, closes the ledger for a moment, and allows himself a brief unmoving rest before the next task, which will be the smaller casks of infused herbal wines near the steps, where the scents of angelica and fennel and mugwort rise like the fragrance of the infirmary garden itself. But that can wait a little longer, and he waits with it, a figure in brown wool standing among the silent barrels. The infused herbal wines of the infirmarian wait near the base of the stone steps, in a small alcove that is neither fully part of the cellar nor separate from it. This alcove is formed by the curve of the stairwell wall and a short return of stone that creates a sheltered pocket where the air is stiller than anywhere else below ground. The casks here are the smallest in the entire inventory. Reduced versions are standard barrels that stand no higher than a man's knee, and they rest on a single broad shelf of elm planks supported by stone corbels. There are 8 of them, each one holding a wine steeped with a particular herb, root or flower prepared by the infirmarian for the sick and the weak. The cellarer approaches this alcove with a measured step, the glass vial already clean and dry in his hand, for he will not use the pewter cup on these wines. Their flavors are too distinct, too medicinal, and a single stray drop could color the tasting of everything that follows. You watch him set the candle on the lowest stone corbel where a natural hollow holds it steady, the flame now burning well into its second tallow stick of the morning. The light falls across the small casks from the side, catching the grain of the elm shelf and the chalk numbers written on each barrel head. These casks are marked not with plain numerals as the others are, but with a number and a letter, 52A, 52B, and so on, because some herbs are infused in more than one barrel and the infirmarian likes to track which batch goes to which patient. The wood of these small barrels is a pale silver grey, for the cooper uses aged birch rather than oak, a wood that imparts almost no flavour of its own and lets the herbs speak clearly. The bungs are sealed with clean linen cloths tied down with twine rather than wax or resin, because the infirmarian visits the cellar often and needs ready access. A small stack of fresh linen tags sits on the end of the shelf beside a pot of ink and a reed pen for his use, separate from the cellarer's own tools. The first cask, labelled 52A, holds wine infused with angelica root, a tall plant that grows in the damp corner of the infirmary garden and sends up globular heads of greenish-white flowers in high summer. The root is harvested in autumn, washed, sliced thin and dried on racks in the warming room before being added to a base of pale southern wine. The cellarer unties the twine around the bung, folds the linen cloth back and draws the bung free with his fingers. The scent that rises from the opening is sweet and aromatic, with a distinct note of candied celery and a faint musky warmth. He lowers the glass vial into the liquid and draws a measure that shows a pale green-gold colour in the candlelight, the clarity perfect. He sips a tiny amount, letting the wine rest on the front of his tongue. The angelica is forward and gentle, a warming sweetness that spreads across the mouth, and the wine beneath it is barely perceptible, just a thin structure of acidity that keeps the herb from cloying. The finish is clean and lingers with a faint bitterness that is not unpleasant. He writes in the ledger, Cask 52A, Angelica wine, pale green gold, clear, nose sweet, with candied celery and musk, palate warming and gently bitter on the finish. Sound, ready for the infirmary. The second cask, 52B, is a second batch of the same Angelica wine made a fortnight later, and he finds it nearly identical in all respects, except that the herb seems slightly more pronounced, as if the later roots had grown stronger before harvest. He notes the difference in a single line and moves on. Cask 52B, Angelica wine, similar colour and clarity, herb slightly more forward, otherwise sound. The third cask shifts to a different herb entirely, mugwort, a grey-leaved plant that the infirmarian calls the traveller's comfort for its reputation in soothing weary feet and promoting sound sleep. The linen cloth on this barrel is marked with a small cross in faded ink, a label from the infirmarian himself. The cellarer unties it and draws the bung. The scent of mugwort is unmistakable, a dry herbal aroma reminiscent of sage but sharper, with a camphor edge that rises and clears the sinuses. The wine in the vial is a pale amber with a slight greenish tinge, and the clarity is good. He sips, and the experience is entirely different from the Angelica. The mugwort wine is dry and slightly astringent, with a bitterness that spreads slowly across the back of the tongue and a cooling sensation that lingers. It is not a pleasant drink in the ordinary sense, but it is not meant to be pleasant. It is meant to be effective. He writes, Cask 53, mugwort wine, pale amber with green tinge, clear, nose of dry sage and camphor, palate dry and astringent with slow bitterness, cooling finish, sound and potent. The fourth small barrel contains wine infused with fennel seed, a remedy for the digestion and for the cough that lingers in old men's chests throughout the winter. The bung comes free with a soft hiss of trapped air that carries the distinct aroma of anise, sweet and clean. The wine in the vial is a clear pale straw, almost colorless at the rim, and when he sips the taste is immediately recognizable. A gentle licorice-like sweetness, soft and soothing, with a mild warmth that spreads down the throat. There is no bitterness at all, only a smooth coating texture and a clean finish. He writes, Cask 54, fennel wine, pale straw, crystal clear, nose of anise and sweet herb, palate soft and soothing with gentle licorice, smooth finish, sound. The fifth cask contains wine infused with betony, a herb the infirmarian prizes above all others, for head ailments and nervous complaints. The linen cover is tied with extra care, the twine looped twice around the bunghole, and he must pick at the knot for a moment before it loosens. The scent of betony is earthy and dark, like dried leaves after rain, with a faint spiciness underneath. The wine is a brownish amber, the darkest herbal batch yet, and the clarity is slightly hazy from the fine particles of dried leaf that even the best straining cannot remove. He sips and finds the flavor deeply earthy, almost mushroomy at first, then giving way to a gentle warmth and a faint numbing sensation on the tip of his tongue. The aftertaste is long and dry. He writes, Cask 55, betony wine, brownish amber with slight earthy haze, nose of damp leaves and spice, palate earthy and warming with numbing tip, dry long finish, sound. The sixth cask has already been partly drawn, its level noticeably lower than the others, and he checks the infirmarian's tag tied to the bung. The tag reads, For Brother Martin's palsy, 1 cup at night in a spidery hand. The wine inside is the same betony infusion, and he tastes it only to ensure it is not spoiled from the frequent opening. It is sound, perhaps a little more oxidized from the air introduced each time the bung is pulled, but still potent. He writes, Cask 56, betony wine, partially drawn, slight oxidation but still sound, note low level for the infirmarian. The seventh small cask shifts the category entirely. It holds wine infused with elderflowers, a preparation made in June when the creamy white blossoms hang heavy on the trees along the monastery wall. The linen cover bears a faded sketch of a flower cluster. He draws the bung and the scent that rises is the prettiest of the morning, a sweet floral perfume that fills the alcove with the memory of summer. The wine is the color of pale honey, perfectly clear, and when he sips the taste is delicate and sweet, with a faint muscat-like grappiness and a lingering floral finish. It is less medicinal than the others, almost a pleasure to drink, and the brothers in the infirmary likely welcome its arrival each evening. He writes, Cask 57, elderflower wine, pale honey, brilliant clarity, nose of sweet blossom and grape, palate delicate and floral with gentle sweetness, perfectly sound. The eighth and final cask rests at the far end of the shelf, slightly behind the others, as if it has been forgotten. It holds wine infused with wormwood, the most bitter of all the herbs, used exclusively for purging fevers and expelling intestinal worms. The linen cloth is marked with a stark black cross. He unties the twine with care, for the aroma of wormwood is so powerful that even a drop on the fingers will linger for hours. The bung comes free, and the scent hits him immediately, intensely bitter and green, like crushed absinthe leaves, with a medicinal sharpness that makes his nostrils flare. The wine in the vial is a dark amber with a greenish cast, and the clarity is good. He sips the very smallest amount he can, barely wetting his lip. The bitterness is immediate and overwhelming, flooding the mouth and drying it completely, and it persists for a long moment before slowly fading. It is exactly as it should be. He writes, Cask 58, wormwood wine, dark amber with green cast, clear, nose intensely bitter and herbal, palate extremely bitter with powerful drying effect, sound, for medicinal use only. He rinses the glass vial 3 times with water from his leather bottle before he is satisfied that no trace of wormwood remains, then dries it thoroughly with a fresh linen cloth from the stack. The pegboard now has 8 more pegs removed, the little wooden markers dropping off one by one like leaves from a late autumn tree. He gathers the used cloths into a pile that he will take up to the laundry yard later, checks that every bung on the herbal wine shelf is secure and every linen cover properly tied, and then turns to the small stack of fresh linen tags the infirmarian left on the shelf's end. One by one, he writes the cask number and the date on each tag and ties them to the corresponding bung, the fresh white linen standing out against the pale birchwood. This task is not strictly part of the tasting, but he does it anyway because the infirmarian is old and his hands shake, and the cellarer knows he will appreciate finding the tags already written when he comes down to draw the evening doses. With the herbal wines finished, he returns to the work table and opens the ledger to the correct page. The entries for the 8 small casks run down the vellum in neat, compact sentences, each one describing a world of flavor in a handful of words. He reads them over, blots the ink once more, and closes the book. The alcove behind him has already returned to darkness as the candle shifts and the little casks sit invisibly on their shelf, their potent contents waiting for the hour when the infirmarian will descend the steps and carry a cup of angelica or betony or fennel up to the sick beds above. The cellarer stretches his neck, tilting his head left and right, and feels the faint creak of tendons that have been still too long. He has been in the cellar now for what feels like the whole morning, though the bells have not rung, and he has no way to measure the hours except the burning of the candles and the slow accumulation of entries in the ledger. The next task lies in the farthest reaches of the cellar, the cold, half-forgotten recess behind the woodpile where 3 casks of perry have sat since autumn, and he will need to carry the candle with him into that damp corner, crouching low under the ceiling's lowest point. But he does not move yet. He stands beside the steps, one hand resting on the newel stone at the bottom of the stair, and listens to the cellar's quiet breathing, the steady drips and the absolute stillness, and the faint, distant scratching that might be a mouse in the woodpile or might be nothing at all. The farthest recess of the cellar lies beyond the woodpile, a place so removed from the main floor that even the candle seems reluctant to reach it. You watch the cellarer lift the light from the stone corbel and carry it across the open space, past the centre aisle with its rows of new wine, past the western wall where the strong beer casks brood in their iron bands, and into the narrow gap between the stacked firewood and the outer foundation wall. The woodpile is taller than a man, row upon row of split beech and ash stacked by the lay brothers in autumn to season through the winter, and its smell is dry and clean, a sweet sawdust fragrance that mingles with the cellar damp. He edges sideways between the cut ends of the logs and the rough stone, brushing against bark and cobweb, until he reaches the small open area behind the stack where 3 barrels of perry have sat since October. This recess is the coldest part of the entire cellar, for it lies directly against the north foundation wall where the earth outside is piled highest and the sun never touches the stone. The ceiling here is barely higher than his shoulders, a sloping slab of unworked rock that forms a natural shelf, and the floor is not packed earth, but bare stone, uneven and slick with condensation. The air feels thicker, heavier, and a faint smell of damp stone and old wood hangs in it without moving. He sets the candle on a small ledge in the rock wall, where a natural fissure forms a shelf, and the light struggles against the darkness, revealing the 3 barrels one by one as his eyes adjust. They are smaller than the cider casks, coppered from a pale grey wood that might be poplar, and they rest not on stillions or cradles, but directly on the stone floor on thin slats of oak to keep the damp from rotting the bottom staves. Each one is marked with a chalk number that is smudged and faded, nearly illegible from the moisture in the air. He crouches to read them, tracing the faint outlines with a fingertip. 59, 60. 61. The perry in these barrels was made from the monastery orchard's small hard pears, a variety that the brothers calls stone pears because they are inedible, straight from the tree, as hard as river pebbles and as sour as crab apples. The fruit was gathered in late September by the novices who complained of the wasps and the bent backs, and it was left in heaps on clean straw in the barn for a full month to soften and sweeten. Only then were the pears milled and pressed, and the juice that ran from the cloths was thin and pale, and smelled faintly of honey, a shy liquid that gave no hint of the quiet transformation waiting inside the wood. The cellarer remembers the pressing day well, for Aldrich had sung a song about pears and lost love in the dialect of his home village, and the abbot had come down to the press-house to taste the first runnings and had nodded once in approval. He crouches before the first cask, number 59, and runs his palm across the head. The wood is cool and dry to the touch, which is a relief, for he had half expected dampness in this forgotten corner. The bung is a small plug of pine, slightly proud of the surface, and he works it free with his thumb and forefinger. The scent that rises from the hole is delicate and surprising, a clean perfume of ripe pear that carries none of the sourness of the raw fruit, and something else, something slightly floral, like the blossom that covered the orchard trees in April. He lowers the glass vial into the liquid, but the perry is so pale that he can barely see it rise in the glass. He holds the vial to the candle and finds the color is a pale straw with the faintest greenish shimmer, the clarity absolute. He sips a small amount and lets it rest on his tongue. The perry is dry and quiet, with a soft fizz that prickles gently and then fades, leaving behind the taste of fresh pear skin and a hint of something nutty. There is no sweetness to speak of, only a clean, refreshing dryness that clears the mouth and invites another sip. He writes in the ledger, balancing the book on his knee, Cask 59, perry from stone pears, pale straw with green shimmer, brilliant clarity, quiet dry fizz, nose of ripe pear and blossom, palate clean and nutty with no sweetness. Sound. The second cask, number 60, sits a little apart from the first, pushed farther into the recess as if someone had tried to hide it. He shuffles on his knees across the cold stone, feeling the chill seep through his robe, and pulls the barrel toward him by the rim. The bung on this one is tighter, swollen by the damp air, and he has to work it back and forth with a gentle, rocking motion before it comes free. The scent that escapes is similar to the first, but fainter, more reserved, as if the perry inside is sleeping more deeply. He draws a sample with the vial and holds it up. The color is the same pale straw, perhaps a shade more golden, and the clarity is perfect. He sips. The fizz in this cask is livelier, a more pronounced sparkle that dances on the tip of his tongue before settling, and the flavor has a slightly baked quality, a hint of cooked pear that reminds him of the winter compote served in the refectory on cold evenings. The finish is drier than the first, with a faint astringency that lingers pleasantly. He writes, Cask 60, color as above with slight golden hue, good clarity, livelier sparkle, nose of baked pear and a trace of honey, palate dry with soft astringency, sound. The third cask, number 61, is the one that gives him pause. Before he even touches the bung, he notices a dark stain spreading from the bottom seam on the forward stave, a patch of wetness the size of his hand that has seeped into the oak slat beneath the barrel. The stain is dry on the surface, dark and slightly sticky, which tells him the leak is slow and intermittent, opening perhaps only when the wood swells and contracts with the temperature changes. He crouches lower, bringing the candle as close as he dares, and inspects the seam where the two staves join. A tiny fissure, no wider than a hair, runs along the join for about 3 finger widths, and at its center a single bead of liquid glistens, a tear of perry that has not yet fallen. He touches it with the tip of his finger and tastes it. It is clean and slightly fizzy, not sour, not spoiled. The leak is small, and the perry inside is still sound, but a leak cannot be left unattended. He draws the bung from this cask with extra care, for he does not want to jostle the barrel and widen the crack. The scent that rises from the opening is the boldest of the three, a punchy pear aroma with a sharp edge of something almost vinegary. He sniffs again, more deeply, and decides the vinegar note is the first volatile lift of a perry that has fermented a little further than the others, not yet a fault, but a note to watch. He draws a sample and holds it to the candle. The color is a deeper gold, almost amber at the rim, and the clarity is good. He sips with care. The perry has a firm, dry fizz that is almost sparkling, and the flavor follows the nose with a tart pear character and that faint volatile acidity on the back of the swallow, a tiny prickling sensation like the aftertaste of a sour apple. It is still drinkable, still pleasant even in its way, but it will not improve with time. He writes in the ledger, Cask 61, bottom seam leak, stain on stave, deeper gold with amber rim, clear, nose punchy pear with volatile edge, palate tart with firm fizz and slight acidic prickle, sound but declining, repair leak and draw soon. Before he writes the entry, however, he must tend to the leak. He sets the ledger aside on a dry patch of stone and crawls back out through the narrow gap to the main cellar to fetch a soft pine wedge from the dish on the work table and the wooden mallet he left beside the strong beer casks. The pine wedges are cut from straight-grained wood, thin as a thumbnail at the tip and winding to the thickness of a thumb at the base, and they are kept precisely for this purpose. He selects one that is slightly longer than the hairline crack, carries it back behind the wood pile, and kneels before the leaking cask. With the tip of the wedge positioned at the top of the fissure where the staves meet, he taps it gently with the mallet, once, twice, 3 times, until the soft pine sinks into the gap and fills it. He taps once more to seat it firmly, then runs a finger over the repair. The wedge sits flush with the curve of the stave, a pale sliver of new wood against the grey poplar. He takes a clean cloth, moistens it with a few drops of water from his leather bottle, and holds it against the repair for a slow count of 20, waiting for the fibres of the wedge to swell and seal the gap completely. When he removes the cloth, the seam is dry. He tastes the perry once more to confirm nothing has been disturbed by the repair, then finishes the ledger entry with a cross in the margin marking the cask for early drawing. The 3 perry casks now stand inspected and recorded, the leaking one mended, and he shuffles backward out of the recess, straightening his spine with a groan that the silence absorbs without comment. The woodpile stands as it was, the stacked logs pale and dry, and the cellar beyond is vast and dark with its waiting rows of barrels. He dusts the knees of his robe, picks up the candle, and carries the image of the 3 forgotten casks with him, 2 sound and patient, 1 wounded but healed. All 3 resting in the cold behind the wood with their quiet fizz and their shy pear perfume. The ledger under his arm holds their names now, written in ink that will outlast the perry itself. He walks back to the work table, sets the mallets and a spare wedge in their places, and stands quietly for a moment, feeling the deep cold of the recess leave his bones, and the slightly warmer air of the main cellar take its place. The morning is still not over, and the next task will be the second tastings and adjustments, the revisiting of casks that earlier showed signs of imbalance, but for now he simply stands and lets the silence be. The second tastings are a quieter ritual within the larger ritual, a revisiting of casks that have already had their moment under the candle, but left behind a small unease in the cellarer's mind. He returns to the work table and opens the ledger to the pages he wrote earlier in the morning, running a finger down the entries until he finds the marks he left in the margins, the circle with the dot beside cask 15, the cider with the faint volatile edge at the back of the swallow, the double line beside cask 21, the small ale with the uniform haze and the green apple note, the small star beside cask 13, the cider with the ruddy amber colour and the suspended haze that knots subtletyed. 4 casks out of the many dozens he has tasted, 4 small uncertainties in a cellar full of sound barrels. He dips the quill and writes a heading on a fresh part of the page, second tastings, 5th day of April, cold and dry. Then he gathers the pewter cup, the glass vial, a clean cloth, and a fresh candle, for the old one has burned down to a stub that threatens to gutter. He begins with the cider, cask 13 on the south wall, the one with the ruddy amber colour and the faint haze. The walk to the south wall is familiar now, his feet knowing exactly where the packed earth dips and where the stylian legs jut out. He sets the candle on the same stone outcrop, crouches before the barrel, and draws a fresh sample with the same steady hand, though this time he watches the stream more closely as it arcs into the cup. The colour is unchanged, a ruddy amber that looks almost like weak tea, and the haze is still present, a fine, even mist that refuses to settle no matter how long he holds the cup still. He carries the sample to the candle and tilts it slowly from side to side, watching the light scatter through the suspended particles. The haze does not move, does not drift, does not gather at the bottom. It is a stable cloudiness, not a progressive spoilage, and he feels a quiet reassurance in its constancy. He breathes in the aroma, dried apple rings and that hint of leather, warm and wholesome. He sips, and the taste confirms what the earlier sample suggested. The round, full flavour with the fully softened acidity and the sweet dried fruit finish. No off-note, no progression toward any fault. The cider has simply developed a natural haze that does it no harm, and he decides to leave it where it is on the south wall, letting it continue its slow mellowing. He writes beneath the heading, Cask 13, second tasting, haze unchanged and stable, aroma and palate as before with full mellow fruit, no faults developing, leave in place. The second cider, Cask 15, is the one that gave him the faint acetic prickle, the tiny catch at the back of the swallow that whispered of possible acetification. He approaches it with a slightly slower step, not from worry, but from the particular attention that borderline casks require. The barrel looks the same as it did hours ago, its bung tight, its staves dry, no sign of any weeping or seepage. He draws the sample and watches the clear golden brown liquid fill the cup. The color is still bright, no dulling or browning at the rim. He raises it to his nose, closes his eyes, and inhales slowly. The first breath is clean apple, ripe and sweet, and then, far at the back of the aroma, the same tiny sharp flicker he noted before. It has not grown stronger. It has not receded. It is exactly as it was. He sips, holding the cider on the front of his tongue, and then letting it travel back exactly as he did the first time. The prickling sensation at the finish is still there, faint and quick, like a single pinprick that vanishes the moment he notices it. It is not worse. The cider is still drinkable, still pleasant, but it is balanced on a threshold, and the cold spring will not hold forever. He decides to move this cask to the north corner, the coldest part of the main cellar, where the temperature might slow whatever quiet transformation is underway. He writes, Cask 15, second tasting, volatile note unchanged and faint, prickling finish, stable, no progression. Move to north corner for cold storage and to be drawn before the warm weather comes. He sets the cup down, walks to the south wall, and with both hands tilts the barrel on its stillion until he can get his arms around it. The cask is heavy, but not unmanageable, and he lifts it in stages, first onto the floor, then rolled along its rim to the north corner, where the sweating stones and the damp earth keep the air several degrees colder than anywhere else. He sets it on an empty stillion beside the mead casks, pushes it flush against the wall, and writes the new location in the ledger margin, moved to north corner, stillion 4. The barrel will wait there, its contents held in the cold embrace of the deepest part of the cellar, and he will check it again before the month is out. The small ale, Cask 21 under the low arch, is his third concern. He stoops through the archway and finds the barrel in the front row, its chalk number still clear on the flank. The bung comes free with the same tightness he noted earlier, the wood still swollen, and he draws a half cup of the pale, cloudy ale. The haze is exactly as it was, a soft, uniform mist that does not shift or settle. He holds the cup to the candle on the wall ledge and studies it for a long count. The cloudiness is stable, the color is still honey amber, and the aroma carries the same green apple and malt character, with no new sourness or must. He sips, and the ale is lively with its mild acidity, clean and refreshing, showing no change from the morning. The cloudiness is not a flaw, but a feature of this particular cask, perhaps from a slower fermentation or a different strain of yeast from Aldrich's brewhouse. He decides the ale is perfectly sound and needs no intervention except to be drunk soon, while its lively character remains. He writes, Cask 21. Second tasting, haze unchanged and stable, aroma and palate as before with mild acidity, no fault, use within the fortnight. He taps the bung back into place, straightens, and stoops back through the arch to the main cellar. The fourth and final concern is the new wine, Cask 50, the barrel with the bung seep that showed a muted color and a dusty finish. He walks to the center aisle and finds the barrel, its chalk mark still clear, the pine wedge he tapped into the bung seam earlier, still dry and firm. No new seepage has appeared, which is the first good sign. He takes the bone knife and breaks the wax seal again, for he had sealed it loosely after the first tasting, and draws a sample with the glass vial. The color in the vial still shows that faint brownish tinge at the rim, the muted ruby that concerned him, but it has not deepened or spread. He holds the vial to the candle and rotates it slowly. The wine is clearer than he remembered, the dullness perhaps a fraction less pronounced under the brighter flame. He sips a small amount and lets it sit on his tongue. The fruit is still quiet, still a little flat, and the dusty quality on the finish is still present, but it is not intensified. More importantly, there is no vinegar, no moldiness, no active spoilage. The wine is simply declining slowly, losing its brightness rather than turning toward anything foul. It is not good enough to keep, but it is not spoiled enough to discard. He considers the options, running through the inventory in his mind, and decides that blending it with a healthier cask from the same terrace will stretch the sound wine a little further while giving the fading wine a backbone to lean on. He writes, Cask 50, second tasting, color and dusty note unchanged, but no progression of fault, no active spoilage, to be blended with Cask 51 for daily table use. Blend tomorrow. He walks to the 10th wine barrel, number 51, the clear ruby with the fresh berry aroma, and draws a small sample to taste beside the fading cask. The contrast is stark. Where Cask 50 is muted and dusty, Cask 51 is bright and lively, with clean acidity and soft tannin. The two will mingle well, the younger wine lifting the older wine stretching the younger, and the resulting blend will serve the brothers' table without disgrace. He records the plan in the ledger with a note to Aldrich, who will help him carry the barrels to the blending vat tomorrow afternoon. Then he seals both casks with fresh linen cloths and ties them down with twine, leaving them ready for the work ahead. With the 4 uncertain casks now revisited and their fates decided, he returns to the work table and sets down the cup and vial. The second tastings have taken less time than the full rounds, but they have required a different kind of attention, a comparative focus that weighs small differences and makes small choices. He reads the ledger entries for the 4 casks one more time, his eyes moving from the stable haze of Cask 13 to the faint prickle of Cask 15, to the lively cloud of Casks 21, to the dusty finish of Cask 50. Each one has been seen twice, noted twice, and given its due. None is a disaster. None is a triumph. They are simply 4 barrels among many, each one tending toward its own quiet destiny in the dark. He closes the ledger and stands without moving for a long while, letting the silence of the cellar rise around him. The drips of condensation from the vaulted ceiling continue their slow, irregular rhythm, a sound so constant that it has become a kind of silence itself. He listens to it now with a deliberate ear, counting the gaps between each fall. 1 drip, a pause of 4 heartbeats, another drip, a pause of 7, a third drip, a pause of 7, a third drip after only 2. The pattern never repeats, and yet it feels ordered, a natural clock measuring nothing but the passage of cold air over cold stone. Beyond the drip, he hears the faint creak of a barrel settling somewhere in the dark, the soft tick of the candle flame as it burns through a knot in the tallow, and his own breathing, slow and even. The high window slits have brightened further, the grey light now a pale silver that touches the upper curve of the vault and reveals the rough texture of the stonework. He can feel the day moving above him, the monastery going about its rounds of prayer and work and reading, but down here the time belongs only to the cellar and its slow transformations. He thinks about the casks he has moved and marked, the small decisions that will shape the weeks ahead. The perry with the pine wedge will be drawn for the refectory before it can decline further. The cider in the north corner will be watched as the spring warms. The ale be drunk by the brothers on an ordinary Tuesday, its haze unnoted by anyone except perhaps Aldrich, who might wonder briefly and then forget. The blended wine will be poured from a plain clay jug and swallowed without comment between spoonfuls of pottage, and the ledger will hold the record of it all, a quiet testimony to the care that kept the cellar in order through a cold spring. He reaches out and touches the leather cover of the book, feeling the grain of the binding under his fingertips, and then he draws his hand back and folds it into the sleeve of his robe. The morning has nearly passed, though no bell has told him so. He can tell by the quality of the light from the window slits and by the depth of the silence, which seems to grow heavier as the day progresses, as if the cellar itself is slowly falling into a deeper sleep. The next task will be the final one of the round, the closing of the ledger, the tallying of the casks, the short summary for the abbot, and the slow climb back up the worn stone steps into the world of grey spring light and cold cloister air. But he does not hurry toward that ending. He remains beside the work table, A man in a brown wool robe standing among the barrels, listening to the drips and the creaks and the quiet breathing of the cellar, and the moment stretches out without demand, without urgency, a calm pause at the end of a long and careful morning. The ledger lies open on the work table, its pages filled with the neat lines of a morning's careful attention. The cellarer draws the candle closer, for the light from the high window slits has begun its slow retreat toward evening, even though the hour is still early afternoon. The grey spring sky having thickened with a bank of cloud that dulls the pale silver to a deeper grey. He turns the pages back to the beginning of the day's entries and begins the final task of the round, the tally and the summary. He reads through the entries in order, starting with the east wall cider casks numbered 1 through 9, and counts them under his breath, a soft murmur that barely disturbs the silence. 1 through 9, 9 casks of cider, all sound. Then the south wall row, 10 through 18, 9 more cider casks, 1 with a faint volatile edge, 1 with a stable haze, all accounted for and noted. The small ale casks under the low arch, 19 through 30, 12 casks in 2 rows. The haze in cask 21 stable and noted. The lively cask 29. A small pleasure, the oldest cask 30, still sound. The 4 mead casks in the north corner, 31 through 34, all brilliant and clear, the orchard blossom mead marked for Michaelmas. The strong beer casks along the western wall, 35 through 41, 7 dark barrels of roasted malt and hop. Cask 37, with the surface rust noted for the smith. Cask 41 with its honeyed depths reserved for the abbot. The new wine in the centre aisle, 42 through 51, 10 barrels of deep ruby and garnet, cask 50 marked for blending, cask 48, a promise of future excellence. The herbal wines on the shelf by the steps 52A through 58, 8 small casks of angelica and mugwort and fennel and betony and elderflower and wormwood, all potent and sound. The perry behind the woodpile, 59 through 61, 3 shy barrels of hard pear, cask 61 repaired with a pine wedge and marked for early drawing. He tallies each group on a scrap of vellum, writing the numbers in a column and adding them with the careful arithmetic of a man who learned his sums from an older cellarer many years ago. 9, 9, 12, 4, 7, 10, 8, 3. He adds them twice to be certain. The total is 62 casks in the cellar on this 5th day of April, all tasted, all recorded, all accounted for. He writes the total at the bottom of the scrap and transfers it to the ledger with a heading, Full Inventory, Spring Tasting, 5th day of April, Year of our Lord 1180. Below it he adds the subtotals for each category and the final number, 62, circled once for emphasis. The summary for the abbot follows a different form, less technical and more narrative, a brief report that will be read aloud or handed over at the evening meeting. He takes a fresh page of the ledger, dips the quill, and writes in his most careful hand, to the Reverend Father Abbot from the Cellarer, greeting. The spring tasting of all casks in the monastery cellar was completed on the 5th day of April in the cold of the morning. 62 casks were tasted and recorded. The cider from the autumn pressing is mellowing well, with 2 casks noted for monitoring. The small ale is sound throughout and should be drawn in the usual order. The honey mead is young and brilliant. The orchard blossom mead particularly promising and recommended for holding until Michaelmas. The strong beer for feast days is in excellent condition, with cask 41 a honey beer of exceptional character suited to your table. The new wine from the southern slopes is young and firm, with cask 48 showing mineral fineness and cask 50 needing to be blended with a sound barrel. The herbal wines for the infirmary are all potent and ready for use. The perry is quiet and dry, with 1 cask repaired for a small leak and drawn soon. The cellar is cold and the casks are sound. I remain your obedient servant. He reads the letter over twice, making 1 small correction to the spelling of Michaelmas, where his quill had slipped, and then blots it dry with a scrap of linen. The letter will be folded and sealed with a drop of plain wax. Not the abbot's seal, but the cellarer's own small stamp. A simple cross within a circle that matches the chalk mark on the eastern wall. He sets the letter aside and returns the ledger to its proper place at the center of the work table, squaring the corners with the edge of the elm plank. Now the closing of the round begins, a sequence of small actions that he has performed after every tasting for more years than he can easily count. First, he cleans the pewter cup, scrubbing it with a dry cloth until the inside gleams faintly in the candlelight, then wrapping it in a clean linen square and placing it in the wooden box that holds the tasting tools. The glass vial he rinses once more with water from his leather bottle, dries inside and out, and slips into its leather sleeve. The willow wand is wiped and laid flat on the shelf beneath the table. The bone knife goes into its pouch. The spare spiles and the dish of pine wedges are checked and tidied, the wedges rearranged by size so that the next tasting will find them ready. The wooden mallet is hung on its hook on the side of the table leg, a small iron ring holding it in place. The cloths he has used throughout the morning, some stained with cider and wine, some merely damp, are gathered into a bundle that he will carry up to the laundry yard. He turns to the candles next. The second tallow stick has burned down to a stub that gutters in a pool of its own wax, and he pinches it out between thumb and forefinger, watching the thin coil of smoke rise and vanish. The first candle, the one from his cell, has already extinguished itself in its iron holder, a small dark wick curled like a question mark in a puddle of cooled tallow. He scrapes the wax drippings from the tabletop with the edge of his thumbnail and collects them in a clay dish kept for that purpose, for the wax will be melted and re-poured into new candles by the chandlery brother. The iron holders are wiped clean and set in a row on the shelf. The cellar now is lit only by the grey light from the high slits, a dim wash that leaves the far corners in complete darkness and makes the barrels seem like sleeping animals huddled against the walls. He lifts the clay jar that holds the dregs of the morning, the accumulated mouthfuls of cider and ale and mead and wine that he did not swallow, and he carries it to the corner bucket, where all the tasting remnants are collected. The bucket is nearly half full now, a dark, miry liquid that will be taken to the kitchen garden and poured onto the compost heap, where it will feed the soil that grows the beans and the cabbages and the herbs that go back into the monastery's pots. Nothing wasted, everything returning. He empties the clay jar, rinses it with a splash of water, and sets it upside down on the table to dry. The pegboard is the last item on the table. All the pegs are now removed, every hole empty, the board a flat piece of elm, with rows of dark circles where the pegs once sat. He hangs it back on its hook on the eastern wall, beside the chalk marks and the tally tags, and runs a finger over the chalked cross within a circle that marks the beginning of the round. It is smudged now from the damp air, and he will redraw it before the next tasting. He takes the lump of chalk from his pouch and places it in the small niche beside the board, ready for that future morning. The cellar is now as orderly as it was when he descended the steps before Lord's. The casks sit in their rows, the tools rest in their places, the ledger contains the morning's work in permanent ink, and the abbot's letter waits to be delivered. He stands in the middle of the packed earth floor and makes a slow turn, scanning each wall in sequence, the east with its chalk marks, the south with its cider row, the archway to the small ale chamber, the north corner with its sweating stones and squat mead casks, the west with its iron-bound strong beer, the centre aisle with its young wine, the alcove with its herbal vials, the dark gap behind the woodpile with its 3 shy perries. Every corner has been visited, every barrel has been tasted. The round is complete. He blows out the last candle, the one he has been carrying since he returned from the recess, and the darkness rushes in, complete and absolute, except for the faint grey rectangles of the window slits high above. The darkness does not feel threatening, it feels like a blanket, thick and soft and familiar. He stands in it without moving, listening to the cellar's sounds one final time. The drips of condensation fall at their irregular pace, a steady percussion that has accompanied every moment of the morning. A barrel creaks somewhere on the south wall, a soft groan of wood settling against wood. From behind the woodpile, a tiny scratching might be the mouse he imagined earlier, or might be the sound of the perry slowly fermenting in its casks. The cold air moves gently against his cheek, a draught from the stairwell that carries the faint, clean smell of the cloister and the damp stone of the upper world. He picks up the bundled cloths and the folded letter and walks to the base of the stone steps. The 7 worn treads rise before him, their centers hollowed by centuries of feet, their edges dark with the damp that never dries. He places his foot on the first step, feeling the familiar dip in the stone, and begins the slow climb upward. Each step is deliberate, his sandals making no sound on the old stone, his hand brushing the wall for balance. The air changes as he ascends. The deep, still cold of the cellar gives way by degrees to a cooler but fresher draught, and the smell of oak and earth fades behind the smell of stone and open air. At the fourth step, the light from the cellar door comes into view, a soft grey glow that outlines the heavy iron strap of the door frame. At the sixth step, he can hear the faint sound of the cloister bell ringing none, the midday prayer, a distant chime that feels like a voice from another world. At the seventh step, he pushes the heavy oak door and steps out into the cellar yard. The cold spring air hits his face, and he blinks in the pale grey light that seems almost bright after the cellar's darkness. The wellhead stands before him, its stone lip dark with moisture, and beyond it, the cloister walk stretches away with its arcade of small columns and its view of the brown garth. The sky above is a uniform pale grey, the clouds low and still, and the air carries the smell of wet soil and the first faint green of growing things. He closes the cellar door behind him, the iron hinges moving in their tallow grease without a sound, and turns the heavy key in the lock. The key he hangs back on its hook under the stone canopy, where it will wait for the next tasting, the next round, the next quiet morning among the casks. He walks across the yard and into the cloister, his sandals making a soft slapping sound on the flagstones that is the loudest noise he has heard all day. The covered walk is empty, the brothers all at prayer in the choir, and the only company he has is the rows of small columns and the brown grass of the garth and the single blackbird that hops across the turf in search of worms. He pauses at the entrance to the cloister walk and looks back at the cellar door, a dark rectangle of oak and iron set low in the monastery wall. Behind that door the casks are sleeping in the dark, their contents slowly turning from sharp to mellow, from young to old, from raw to ready. The ledger on the table holds their names and their conditions, and the abbot's letter in his hand will tell the day's story to the one who needs to know it. The cellar will wait, as it always waits, for his next descent with a candle and a cup and a clean cloth. He turns away, and the blackbird flies up from the garth, and the cloister bell falls silent, and the cold spring afternoon settles over the monastery, like a hand smoothing a blanket. Inside the cellar, the darkness is complete, and the drips of condensation continue their slow, patient rhythm, marking time that no one counts, speaking to an audience of oak and earth and stone that asks no questions and needs no answers. The casks rest on their stillions and their cradles and their cold slats, and they do not stir, and they do not call, and they do not dream. They simply wait, and the waiting is its own kind of peace.